Hey Cameron, it's Thursday, November 12th, and thought we'd have Bible study. I spoke with our friend Jim Hudson today, and he was sort of lovingly giving me a hard time that Bible study hasn't been as regular in the past few weeks, and he's right. Part of that's due to my health. I've had a terrible sinus infection, and I'm on my third round of antibiotics. And additionally, I also took a round of steroid pills last week. So it's been a pretty horrendous sinus infection. Man, it's tough, but I appreciate your patience. So we're still, unfortunately, kind of in a degree of uncertainty about the election, which I just find almost hard to believe that this is the state of American politics. So I've thought about what to read and what to look at for Bible study this week. And I really love the book of Samuel. And so I wanted to read from Samuel, and because this is where the people of Israel really wanted a king. And Samuel is kind of a transitional figure from this time of judges and prophets and priests to the period of the development of the monarchy. And Israel changes during Samuel's life, and Samuel is a pivotal figure in that transition of Israel. So, we know that Samuel is called. He's sort of, from the time before he was born, his mother kind of promises that if, Hannah says, if you'll let me have a child, I'll give him to the Lord. And so Samuel comes, and he's kind of raised by the priests. I'm just trying to find this passage. It's pretty early on when they say, we want a king. And Samuel tells them, you don't want a king. Like, if you want a king, it's not going to be good. And they're gonna take your sons to join the army. They're gonna tax you. They're gonna, do all this stuff that kings do, and you don't really want a king. So this is from the 8th chapter of 1 Samuel, and we want to read this. And it says, "And it came about when Samuel was old, that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of the firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah, and they were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain, and took bribes and perverted justice. And all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, Behold, you've grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all they have to say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all deeds which they have done since the day I brought them up out from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then, listen. to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them. Verse 10, so Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. And they said, this will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some of his plowing, and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war, and equipment for his chariots. And he will also take your daughters to be perfumers, and cooks, and bakers. And he will take the best of your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. And he will take 1/10 of your seed in your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. And he will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. And then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them to the Lord's hearing, and the Lord said to Samuel, listen to their voice, and appoint them a king. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. So of course then Samuel goes, and the Lord guides him, and he selects from the tribe of Benjamin the first king of Israel, Saul. And that of course doesn't work out well, but that's a different story. It seems to me that, and I'm just going to speak openly about this in a hopefully a nonpartisan manner, but it is a natural inclination of any people that we all want a leader. And Americans are no different. I'm told that, upon America sort of winning its freedom in the Revolutionary War, there was a movement to sort of proclaim George Washington as the King of America. And George Washington sort of had to decline that in favor of a constitutional republic, which would come a few years later at the Constitutional Convention, and I think that culminates in 1789. So it took some time from 1776 to 1789 to kind of iron out some of the details of how our government should run. But Samuel here is telling them, look, if you have a king, there's problems with a monarchy, and you need to understand what those problems will be. Because why do they want a king? And they say that he might judge us and go out before us to fight our battles. They want security. They want certainty. They want someone to establish law and someone to lead them to protect them from their enemies. And of course, what Samuel is warning them is, if you do that, you're giving up your freedom and your children's freedom. So it's that kind of classic exchange of freedom for security. And that's a delicate balance, and we as Americans are always seemingly having to hash out and rediscuss the value of freedom versus security. Absolute freedom is very difficult in any kind of a society, but absolute safety and security would amount to some sort of a totalitarian state without any freedom or the ability to speak out, and we certainly don't want that. Samuel is warning us because they want to be like the rest of the world. Everybody else is a king. We want a king. And Samuel is saying, but you're supposed to be different. You're the nation of Israel. You're God's chosen people. God is your king. God is your king. And, we as Americans kind of live in two worlds, almost dual citizenship, right? We are citizens of the world, Americans, and we are citizens supposedly in the kingdom of heaven, and that's where our ultimate identity should be rooted, but we have to live in the world and kind of deal with the problems of the world. And so, as much as we would love it to say we have no king but Jesus, we also have to sort of reckon with what does it mean that the President of the United States, who is not a king, and should be under the checks and balances of a three-fold government, is also probably the most powerful leader in the known world, maybe the free world. So, we're very firm in the fact that we do not elect a king, and that our authority should not be transferred through bloodlines or through nepotism. But it does happen in some ways. Like we've seen now that we have two. Was it John Adams and John Quincy Adams and George H.W. and George W.? We've had two times where the son of a president became a president. That's something. And we almost had a similar situation, I guess, when Mrs. Clinton ran. We almost had the wife of a former president becoming the chief executive. So, and it's just amazing how so many of our presidents' paths have crossed, and they're kind of this group. Like, for example, I remember in 2004, when Secretary Kerry was running against then President Bush, it was pointed out that both of them had been at Yale and were members of the same secret society, Skull and Bones, and that they really were connected in a number of ways. So had George H.W. Bush, I think, had been Skull and Bones at Yale. So, to say that we're simply electing them from the public at large seems kind of hard to say sometimes, too. Samuel is speaking at a time when he has done a wonderful job. I mean, if you read the book of Samuel and you read about what Samuel did in his life and how devoted he was to God and to his faith and to the nation, it's amazing. But like so many who devote themselves to their career, even when their career is very important and a high calling, what happens to his sons? He appointed his sons to be judges over Israel. And the name of the first was Joel, the name of the second was Abijah, and they were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, this is verse 3, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. As good as Samuel was, and this happens, I mean, we see this, maybe he was so committed to his work that he wasn't able to be as personally involved in the rearing of his children and their guidance and moral formation as he could or should have been. That's a stretch. That's conjecture on my part. Maybe they were grown men and they just made bad decisions and it wasn't Samuel's fault at all. That's certainly another equally possible situation. But the problem is that they were bad and they did pervert justice and they did take bribes. And all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. That's verse 4. And they said to him, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations." I think the problem with the people here, so their situation is, there is injustice in the land, right? These sons of Samuel And they were pretty happy when Samuel was doing the judging. Like, Samuel was kind of regarded as fair, a holy man, a godly man, a good man, a prophet. He was trustworthy. Like, Samuel was great. And as long as he was kind of handling things, it was fine. It was fine. But as he's gotten older and he's trying to turn some stuff over to his sons are not. They're not. They're who their father was. And so the people, they're basically saying, we want someone to basically take care of us. We want someone to just be the king and just tell us what to do and solve our problems. I think all of us want that. I think all of us kind of want someone to just step in and solve the problem, tell us what to do. And I think that's what's wrong here. I understand what the people want, and I understand that inclination to just, let's have, the government solve it. We want a stronger king who can just have more power and authority and can solve our problems for us. But what Samuel's saying is, the more authority you give them, the more freedom you're going to lose, and your children are going to pay for that. So, and I think Americans, by, kind of historically, are sort of very aware of that trade, right? What's the famous Benjamin Franklin quote? He who desires security at the expense of liberty deserves neither. I'm paraphrasing there, but I think that's pretty close to the gist of it. So what does that require? If a king is not really the right answer, and Samuel's telling them it's not, what do they need to do? Well, maybe they should have prayed. Maybe Samuel should have been willing to recognize that his boys were not holy. Even up to this point, genealogy does not always determine who should be in charge. So Abraham's bloodline, does have some inclusion in the kingdom. But for example, Moses' sons did not take over authority. It's Joshua, the son of Nun, who takes authority from Moses. I think this historically is fairly true. It's certainly true in the monarchy of Israel. Monarchy is hit and miss at best. Even if you start off with somebody great who's really good at being the king, often that is such an all-consuming job that he's not the most present or able father, and then therefore his offspring who take over for him are not always great people. David begets Solomon, but Solomon, and there's a lot of unfaithfulness in the line of David, in that line of kings, both in Judea and Israel. Some were faithful, not all. And I think that's true in most monarchies. Being a king or a queen, especially in a nation of any power or influence, has got to be incredibly time consuming and incredibly demanding. And then your children are invariably going to grow up as the children of privilege, and that is not a great way to breed humility or train humility into people. And I think humility is a cornerstone of good leadership. Certainly a Christian virtue. So, I think we've seen that God's system of appointing judges and prophets by this point was really the best way to kind of suss out who needed to be in charge. Who needed to be in charge but always recognizing that for God's people, God is always and forever the true king. So, what's the alternative is the people need to renew their faithfulness. The people need to look to God to guide them. Yes, they may have needed a prophet, priests, judges, kind of a temporary leaders that are guided by God and appointed by God. But a monarchy is putting too much faith in a human form of government. And I wonder if we don't have some of that here in America. I'm always kind of amazed at what we expect the president to do. I think, I'm going by my old, 11th and 12th grade civics lessons, but, the executive branch of government, of which the president is the head, is supposed to enact and enforce the laws as they are passed by Congress. The president is not supposed to be making up policy or enacting policy. If those laws are unconstitutional or illegal or somehow not appropriate, then suits can be raised, and the Supreme Court can rule certain laws to be unconstitutional or inappropriate. And that may happen from time to time. The court, however, should not be making laws. That is the purview of Congress. And we get I think people on either side, we get excited when the president may start issuing executive orders when it, sort of aligns with our agenda. We should be weary anytime the president starts to overreach his or her constitutional authority, right? Because it cuts both ways. I'm reminded of that great play and film, A Man for All Seasons, right? You all may remember this, but it's a story really of when King Henry VIII wanted a divorce from his first wife, and his good friend, the Lord Chancellor of England, Thomas More, would not go along with him. And the Pope rejected the king's petition for divorce or annulment. And so the King Henry VIII, very famously, left the Church of England, or took the Church of England away from the Catholic communion, declared it autonomous, and declared himself to be the head of the Church of England. And this is the establishment of the Anglican Church. Thomas More, his friend, longtime friend, and the Lord Chancellor, would not approve of this. And so he was stripped of his title, persecuted, and ultimately, I think, beheaded as a martyr for remaining Catholic and in communion with Rome. There's a wonderful scene in that film. St. Thomas More, of course, becomes the patron saint of all lawyers. There's a wonderful scene where Thomas More is speaking with his rather gung-ho son-in-law. And he's kind of a mercurial young man who's, strong in emotion and strong in feeling, but he doesn't always think things through. And Thomas More says, what would you do to get at the devil, to fight evil? And he said, I would do anything. He said, would you flatten all the laws in England to get at the devil? And the young man said, yes, I would flatten all the laws if it meant that I could get at the devil. And Thomas More very carefully and very wisely asks, and what would you do when all the laws flattened and the wind blows cold on you? and the devil turns round on you, where then would you hide? And I think that's always stuck out to me as the necessity of the law and the law's protections, especially those for us as Americans in the Bill of Rights and so forth, that we need to preserve them because they may be inconvenient when we find ourselves in the majority, but they may be our only protection when we find ourselves in the minority. A lot of celebrations sort of happened because presumably Mr. Biden has won the election, and there's always celebrations anytime there's a new president or anytime we have an election. It's easy to get swept up in that. But how much faith are we putting in our government versus putting in our God? Are we looking like the Israelites for kind of a quick fix, for someone to come in and solve all our problems? Should we not be looking into our own hearts for our need for prayer, our need for listening to God, our need to maybe even be a little more self-sufficient? We have a lot of division in this country. I don't think these elections turned out like anybody thought they would. I think what they demonstrated is that we are far more sharply but closely divided than anybody realized. It's almost 50-50, and the differences between us can seem rather stark. It especially seems so this year, I think, when maybe we've been more isolated from one another than we normally are because of the COVID. But I tell you, I think this. My parishioners, I know parishioners on both sides who have voted differently from one another. And I love them all. And I know all of them to be good and decent people. All of them. And they all voted with the best of intentions and the best reasons in their heart. And if you put those people together into the same room or give them a common purpose, they love one another and they work together. Just fine. Just fine. We are never going to be unified through an election. I think that's why the founding fathers, put the election in November and put the inauguration in the end of January. Give everybody time to cool out. Cool out. I'll tell you what's going to heal wounds. You go love that neighbor that voted differently. You go to that neighbor with that different political sign in their yard, bake them a pan of cookies or brownies, and talk about their family. Talk about something else. Talk about sports. Talk about something that there's no need to disagree on. Find a common purpose. Maybe they need help raking their leaves in their yard, or find something in common. Love your neighbor. See the good in them. I think we all have a tendency to try to beatify our choice of candidates. Beatification is that process on the way to formalized sainthood in the Catholic Church. And so we have this tendency, I think, once we kind of decide, well, this is who I'm voting for. We want to believe that the person we're voting for is a good person, and that the other candidate is a bad person. And I will tell you that I think every president accomplishes some good things and does some bad things. And the things they accomplish matter more to their supporters, and the bad things they've done matter less to their supporters. And then when it's your candidate's term, the good things they've done matter more to you, and the bad things they do matter less to you. That's just the way it is. Most presidents, at least in my lifetime, I can't think of one who didn't. Got some good stuff done and did some bad stuff. Stuff they did that I liked mattered more to me and I voted, and the stuff that they did that other people didn't like mattered less to me and that didn't bother me as much. And nobody's got an objective truth meter on that. Let me say that again. Nobody's got an objective truth meter on that. That's up to God. Some people were, I know around here in Fairfax County, some people were really offended by President Trump. And I can understand some of it. But sometimes he would say stuff and I was just like, why is that offensive? I don't understand why that's offensive. And, they vote the other way. So they were extra offended. I can remember a time when President Obama would say some things and people would be nodding their head, and I thought, that is not okay to say that. It's not okay to say that. Nobody's got an objective filter. All of us vote, despite our best efforts to be objective and intellectual about it. Everybody votes emotionally at some level. They do. It's got to sit right with your gut. It's got to. And some of that means we have to talk ourselves into it. Even if we deep down are actually holding our nose and voting, we have to kind of justify it and talk ourselves into we're doing the right thing and the best thing, and a little humility, I think, is recognizing that to some extent all of us are holding our nose and voting. Not perfect candidates on either side. And the real solution is that we should look for God's guidance and try to be more faithful rather than rely on any government built on faulty humanity. So, also I want to say this. This happens every time there's a new president elected. The winners, quit telling people to unify. Shut up till January, okay? I think the founders were right to put Inauguration Day in January. There's a lot that has been said on both sides that was really mean, and people just need to cool out. If you won, or who knows at this point, but if you think you won, let people who didn't alone. Let them alone. I had someone, someone said to me recently that President Trump was the most divisive president that they've ever seen. Maybe to them. If you're from where I'm from, President Obama was incredibly divisive for a lot of people. Mrs. Clinton was an incredibly divisive candidate. And Trump supporters have been called Nazis, racists, deplorables, all kind of un-American fascists for 4 to 5 years. And if Trump has lost now, y'all are simply telling, oh, now we're going to be the party of unity and we're going to be the healer. There was too much mud slung on both sides for there to be immediate unity. Leave people alone. Let them cool down. Go cook your neighbor a pan of brownies and talk about something else. You want to build unity? Don't pick at scars. Okay? Move on. And understand that this election was close. Close. How do we build bridges? Find common ground. And politics right now isn't it. Find a way to love people. Find a way to love people. So that's a word for today. I think we're not much different than the people in Samuel's era. We want someone to come in, and rescue us and take care of us, And I think the lesson here is that Samuel was right. Basically what he's telling them is, you people have no idea what trading liberty for security will cost you. And maybe you ought to be more faithful. Maybe you ought to trust God more. And maybe we all ought to be a little more self-sufficient rather than looking for someone to just come in and take care of us. Because ultimately all governments will perish. None of them are permanent. The only eternal king is King Jesus. So that's it. That's the lesson for this week. I'd like to end with a prayer for our nation, and I also want to take this time, a day late, to thank our veterans for any veteran who has served in peacetime or in wartime. Thank you for your service and the way that you have contributed to our nation and to our nation's promise of freedom. To my granddad who served in World War II, to my dad who fortunately served 20 years in peacetime, thanks to them, to my brother who served as an Air Force officer, to our friends in Washington State, Colonel and Mrs. Sakuma. Thank you, Colonel, for your service, and Mrs. Sakuma, I know the role of an Army wife, just like my mom, deserved its own appreciation. Thank you to my wife and our many civilian civil service for the way that you have worked diligently and tirelessly for our nation's freedom. You guys don't wear a uniform, but y'all do a tremendous amount to keep us safe that our nation isn't always as aware of. I'd like to thank so many of the guys that I know from home. My Uncle Frank, who served in Vietnam, my brothers in scouting, Andrew Lepasier, Tyke Journey, Jake Thompson, I believe, who served a while, guys who have served in this current conflict. I want to thank my friends from college, Colonel Chris Nunn, Stacy Bear, Sean Nickel, John Brooks, Joe Smith, Tristan DeBoard, guys that I was in ROTC with who all went to combat. And I want to thank members of this congregation who have served at various times. Al Googles, Howard Nesselrod, Dave West, Mike McLean, who's now a pastor in Kentucky, and Nate Seymour, and who is still serving, and Brandon Sikora and his family, who's serving in the Air Force. I want to thank all of Cameron's veterans, and we remember, of course, Mr. Fred Campbell served proudly in the Marine Corps, and gosh, so many that have, Jim Hudson, so many that have served and continue to do so. And so thank you all for your service. Thank you all for your service. I hope I haven't overlooked. I'm sure I'm missing some names, and I don't do that intentionally. I'm kind of off the cuff, but thank you all for Mr. Roy Smith, who he and I used to talk about his service, and I just I always enjoy talking with our veterans, and to my buddies in the chaplain corps, to Chaplain Karen Meeker, to Bill Kim, to Sean Dennis, to those guys that have served in that capacity, thank you. It was an honor to serve with you. One thing, Colin Falkenstein, my good friend, I just wanted to mention him. One thing that I do want to say, that especially for those that have served in combat, I see the change and the toll that combat has taken in many of your lives. And it's different for everybody. Some guys have come home and they've been able to kind of go back to a normal way of life. Some guys, they're experiencing combat compounds with other events in their life, and they're kind of forever changed. But all of them, even those serving in peacetime, service changes a person. It changes a person. And in a way, every one of them, every service member, I think, to some extent or another, sacrifices a part of themselves and willingly goes through that change to serve the country and to ensure our freedom. And that's a big thing. And I guess, I'm old enough now, and I served just long enough in the Army to see that guys that I went to ROTC with, or guys that I grew up with in scouting, Freddie Fields would be another serviceman. I saw who they were before, and I've seen how combat has changed them to some degree, to the degree that they kind of let me see. And I want to thank you. And if any of you ever want to talk, or have a cup of coffee, or just need to share, I'm here. I'm here. And I want to tell you that your contribution and your sacrifice for our nation is not unseen. Not unseen. And we care. So if you ever need to talk, I'm here. Call me, email me, whatever. And I will always be grateful for your work and the way in which you served. I want to mention a couple more guys, especially my ROTC cadre. Thanks to Colonel Christopher Blaylock for his good work and leadership, and on two of my favorite NCOs, First Sergeant Timothy Lindsay and Sergeant First Class Will Kavanaugh, who are both retired now, and we're just incredibly good. It's airborne. And and to the countless others I know I'm missing, and I don't know why I can't call all their names, but thank you, all of you. I'm proud to know all of you. And my life is better, and I'm a better person for having known you. So, So for this Veterans Day, a little belated, thank you for your service all the way.